Excellent. I've made it so that I can also see the chat box because I'm going to ask you to put things in the chat box and stuff kind of as we go along. Any questions that come up as we go through, just ask them and I can just answer them as we go. I'll also hang on at the end of the call just in case anybody has any like pressing questions or anything else that they want to chat about. I can chat all day. So yeah. Happy to answer questions at the end as well. So welcome to this session. It's really great to see so many people and see so many like faces and people that want to think about LGBT inclusion in their sort of organizations. I would really encourage you through the session to think about the things that we talk about in relation to your job role and like the things that you do at work, but also throughout kind of your social life and the way that you kind of navigate your social situations and things like that, and who you might be talking to and thinking about through that as well. I've got a few little bits. So closed captions are on. If you want to turn them on, there's a little CC right at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes I talk fast and northern, so it gets confused with words that I say. So bear with me when I'm doing sort of terminology stuff, because sometimes it can get confused with me. But yeah, my name's Antonia. To introduce myself a little bit, my pronouns are she, they. I use them interchangeably, so any is fine. I work at Come Play With Me, which is a record label based in Leeds. I'm not based in Leeds, I'm in North London. So I basically do Come Play With Me work as the diversity inclusion person, doing lots of different events, workshops like this one. We do sort of releases for minority groups. So we predominantly work with LGBT people. We also do sort of releases and projects aimed at people of colour. We're doing some neurodiversity work in the next sort of few months, working with some suicide prevention organisations to do some workshops around well-being in music and all that kind of thing. So yeah, lots going on at Come Play With Me, but it's fun and interesting and great. I get to meet so many cool people. I'm also club secretary at a football club called Stonewall FC, who are the oldest LGBT football club in London, which is super fun. Being club secretary sounds really exciting, but it's actually mostly just emailing people called Bob that work for different football leagues. So it's not as exciting as you would think. It's just paying fines for people that get yellow cards quite a lot. So, but it's really fun. I also play for their women and non-binary team. And we play in a couple of different leagues that are sort of like trans inclusive and LGBT inclusive. So we work with them a lot and sort of share policy and all that kind of thing. Lots of different things. I also run loads of different workshops like this one, work with HR teams, music organizations, record labels, etc. to like work on LGBT inclusion and trans inclusion policies, but also processes to help them implement those policies and how they can sort of think about inclusivity throughout their work. I'm going to kick us off by just asking you some questions. So if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat box, it'd be great. I feel like a couple of people might got muted. I think a couple of people might know each other already, but it'd be good to see kind of who's in the room and what people are up to and what you kind of want to get out of this session, really. Lots of people working in small organizations, working with young people, community engagement, singing teacher and singer. Excellent. Brill. This is cool. I think as well, like what's really interesting about sessions like this is that everybody kind of comes to them wanting to just learn more and think more about like how they can be inclusive and what kind of things that they can do. So hopefully everyone's kind of, yeah, gonna get some bits out of that. My boss is here as well. That's nice. Hi, Toni. Amazing. So many people working with young people, which is great. Marketing dudes at Brighter Sound. Love Brighter Sound. Amazing. Great. Thank you. Live music now. Lots of different people from different places as well. Like sometimes when I do these sessions, I'm like, there's so many people from London, but actually there's lots of different people in this group, which is great. I love that job description. Is social media marketing queen your full official job title? Is that what? Professional queer is my actual job title. Events managers, great. This is cool. There's gonna, hopefully a lot of you will be able to kind of come out of this with some like actions that you can take today or in the next few months that will help you like make the things, the sort of places that you work a little bit more inclusive, and the things that you do more inclusive for LGBT people. So the session today, we're going to cover a little bit of LGBT language terminology. We'll talk about identity a little bit in a little bit more depth. But really that sort of exercise is to get you thinking about language that people might use to describe themselves, or language that different communities use in different situations and things like that. You might know some of the words already. I'm sure you probably will. There might be some that you've not heard before. As we go through that kind of exercise, I would really encourage you to ask questions and think about like your identity and how it plays into how you work and where you work and things like that. I'm going to touch on a few different stats about LGBTQ experiences, specifically for young people. There'll be a bit of a trigger warning in there for self-harm, suicide. It's 2 slides and I'll tell you when they're coming up. So if you want to mute, you can mute, and I'll just write something in the chat when it's over. And then we'll think about that in relation to creating an inclusive environment for young LGBT people, and how you can sort of make the work that you're doing a little bit fairer and more equal. And we'll talk about kind of the difference between equality and equity, and how we get to a place of kind of social justice for people. So the first part of the session is going to be sort of language and terminology and thinking about identity and what that actually means. I've put some words on the screen. If you could think about any of the definitions of these words and stick them in the chat, or just unmute and tell me them, that would be great too. If you want to do the hands up thing, that's fine, and we can do that. But yeah, to get a little bit of an idea of where we're at, it'd be great to see if anybody can define any of these words. These are the bits where I leave you in like awkward silence. Now I've just seen Casper's message in the chat, so, and I just really want to hear the glam punk band. So if you could send me a link, that'd be fab. Yep, we've got someone who's done the LGBTQ acronym. Yep, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, plus. Sometimes you'll see it with LGBTQIA. That includes intersex and agender identities. A lot of the time as well, you'll just see LGBT plus, and that's it. That's mainly because a lot of the time in sort of governmental policy and all that kind of thing, it's just LGBT plus that's used. So a lot of sort of charities and things like that will use just LGBT plus because it kind of matches people that they're sort of lobbying and things like that in government. Got lots of answers in here. I'm going to go through them one by one. So trans, someone has already popped this in the chat, but yes, it's an umbrella term. So it's used to describe people whose gender isn't the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth. It doesn't have to be something that is not the same. It could be just something that doesn't sit comfortably with that sex that they're assigned at birth. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail afterwards. Non-binary, gender non-conforming, very similar things. Yeah, non-binary. So a couple of people put this in the chat, someone who doesn't identify as either gender. So yeah, again, it's an umbrella term. It's quite a broad spectrum of people. It's an umbrella term for someone who doesn't identify as only male or only female. It might be someone that identifies as both or neither, someone that completely rejects that gender as a concept. There's a kind of myth, I think, sometimes that non-binary people are like bang in the middle of the spectrum of like male and female. If you imagine like male and female at either end, a lot of people think that non-binary people sit just like bang in the middle of that and are 50% of either. Actually, like that spectrum is very broad, and people can be anywhere within that at any given time. It's quite a fluid thing. So you might get someone that dresses quite feminine and is quite feminine presenting, but is still using they them pronouns and still identifies as non-binary, in the same way that you might find someone, you know, that's quite masculine presenting, that has facial hair, etc., and that also identifies as non-binary. It's not really a super sort of like androgynous thing that people are that bang in the middle of that. It can be kind of a very broad, like it's a very broad group of people. Lesbian, someone's put this in already, but yes, that just refers to a woman who has romantic or sexual orientation towards women. And we've had a couple of people already talk about pan and bi. Pan being an attraction to people regardless of gender, Rachel's put in there, which is yes. And bi, very similar things, right? So pan or pansexual is basically used to describe romantic or sexual orientation that isn't limited by sex or gender, and bi is an umbrella term, again, used to describe someone's romantic or sexual orientation towards more than one gender. Very similar things, but the personal preference of people, whether they use bi or pan, is kind of, some people use them interchangeably, some people are really attached to bi as a kind of word that they want to use, in the same way that a lot of people have started using pan to feel like it's more than one. You know, people often say that bi means two. In the case of like bi identities, it's very much an umbrella term, doesn't necessarily mean two. But yeah, for the sake of language evolving, a lot of people started using pan or pansexual. The reason the asterisk is on there, and I've taken the word sexual off the end, is that often it doesn't have to just be a sexual orientation. It could be people that you're romantically attracted to or emotionally attracted to as well. So it kind of takes the onus off it being something that is predominantly sexual. It's not off, like it could just be any kind of relationships. We've got a question from Rachel about the word queer. It's actually on this next slide, so I'm gonna hang on with that. But if anyone wants to define any of these words, that would be fab. Particularly transitioning or cisgender, if anybody has any definitions of those, that would be great. Fran, cisgender, the sex you were assigned at birth matches your gender identity. Yep, basically they all come up in order, so I'm going to go through them in order, but yes, assigned at birth is the right term. So pronouns are basically words that we use to refer to someone's gender in conversation, mostly when they're not there, so he, she, or they. Transitioning is basically the steps that a trans person might take to live in the gender in which they identify. So it might involve medical intervention, it might not, it might just be social, but it can include everything from changing your name, changing your pronouns, all the way through to some kind of medical intervention. So it's a very, very broad spectrum of things that could be someone's transition. It could just be, you know, changing your gender markers on different sort of identification documents, or, you know, changing your pronouns, etc., dressing differently. But it could be top surgery or bottom surgery, things like that as well. More often than not, it's not medical intervention, because medical intervention is extremely expensive. So, you know, there's a myth sometimes in the media that, you know, all trans people are accessing hormones and accessing, you know, gender affirming medical surgeries and all these things, but actually that's not the case. There are quite a lot of people that either don't want that, or also kind of can't necessarily afford that. It's a very long and expensive process to do things like that. So a lot of the time, you know, transitioning is a thing that takes a long time for people, and often doesn't end and is something that is a continued thing throughout their lives. Gay, I think someone's put this in there, but it refers to a man who has romantic or sexual orientation towards men. And queer, yeah, some people have had a bit of a chat about this in the chat box, but it's often a term used by people that want to reject specific labels of like everything from romantic orientation, sexual orientation to gender identity. It has been used as a slur in the past. So a lot of people have kind of reclaimed that word as something that they want to use to describe themselves. I use that word to describe me. So I guess a very specific, a very specific example of using myself is that, you know, I use the word queer because it, for me, covers everything. It covers my romantic orientation and sexual orientation, but it also covers my gender identity and the way that I dress and my sort of like, you know, my gender expression and the way that I express myself through my clothes or through my hair or through like the way that I act and live. So for me, it feels more like a catch-all term for everything about me, which I think is quite nice and gives me a bit of freedom. Doesn't really put me in a box, if that makes sense. So yeah, there are definitely people that I wouldn't use the word queer in front of, friends that I have that are perhaps older, particularly older gay men that I know, like I wouldn't even use that word to describe myself in front of them because they kind of have had it used against them as a slur for so long in so many ways that I know that it wouldn't sit right with them. So there's that kind of thing. I think being led by the people who use these different words for themselves is really important. So yeah, I wouldn't call anybody queer if I didn't know that that's what a word that they used for themselves. And yes, Nina's just put a question in, do women and lesbians not use the term gay? Yes, quite often actually, gay can be used as a term for women and men and quite a lot of people as well. Again, I think it's just personal preference. And cis and cisgender, we've had a couple of people talk about this in the chat already again, but basically it is someone whose gender identity is the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth. And I think what's interesting about the word cis and cisgender is that 5 years ago when I started doing this, no one really knew what that meant. And a lot of people were kind of like, oh, what is that word? But actually now a lot of people have started to use it and have started to think about it a lot more in terms of identity and in terms of different people's identity. I think what's interesting as well is like that being used for someone whose gender identity is the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth is very important because transgender is used to describe someone whose gender identity isn't the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. Having a word for both those things means that trans people, because they're the minority, they're less than 1% of the population, it means that they're not othered. And I think it's very similar to the way that like you have homosexual and heterosexual, and you have something that describes all identities. I think that's really important in terms of like being able to describe yourself, being able to not feel othered by not having, you know, an opposite or something like that to describe other people. And yeah, I think it being used to describe people whose gender identity is exactly the same as the sex that they're assigned at birth is fine to use. Again, like it's not something that you would use often to describe yourself. You wouldn't sort of introduce yourself as, oh, hello, my name is whatever, and I'm cisgender. In the same way that trans people have absolutely no obligation to introduce themselves by telling you they're transgender. I guess it's a very similar thing. So yeah, any other questions on any terminology would be wonderful. But I wanted to sort of bring this into thinking about identity and kind of how some of these things on this slide kind of feed into those words that we've just sort of gone through. So your sex assigned at birth is most likely decided when you're born by a doctor. It's based on external characteristics and genitalia. Basically, the doctor will pull you out, look at you and decide whether you're a boy or a girl. And then you're brought up in a way that, you know, within society's expectations of what is a boy and what is a girl, that's how you're kind of brought up. Your gender identity, however, is your sense of your own gender. So it might correspond to the sex that you're assigned at birth, and it might not. So there's lots of sort of different gender identities and like nuance within that. A lot of people, their gender identity will match the sex that they were assigned at birth. That's fine. That's how they will like live their lives. If your gender identity isn't the same as the sex that you were assigned at birth, that's where you start to find barriers in different parts of, you know, accessing services, education systems, all that kind of thing. And I want to think about emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction too. So like your emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to another person or lack of. And helpfully, Rianne's just put a question in the chat about aromantic and asexual. So aromantic and asexual people basically don't have romantic attraction or sexual attraction to people. There's lots of different nuances within asexual and as identities, but thinking about like how people are perhaps romantically attracted to certain people but not sexually attracted to them. You might be emotionally attracted to different people. So your emotional attraction a lot of the time is kind of like friendships and things like that, and romantic and sexual attraction are people that you're kind of in relationships with or have sex with. And that attraction might be different to different genders and different types of people. You might not have any sexual attraction to people. You might not have romantic or emotional attraction to people. So as identities, so aromantic and asexual, fit within that. And it's very easy to forget that those identities exist, and they're left out a lot of different sort of things around policy and especially sort of like governmental policy and things like that. And a lot of people that work in LGBT activist circles often forget that those identities exist. So there's a lot of organizations that do work around that to try and make sure that those people are not forgotten within the LGBT community. And gender expression, this is the one that kind of, I always think about, like everybody has a gender expression, but actually it's like how a person expresses their gender, and it's usually within the context of society's expectations. And what's interesting about that is when I do a lot of sessions like this, I get mostly cisgender, like female assigned at birth people that think about their gender expression a lot more than like people that are assigned male at birth and their gender identity is male. You get a lot of people that think about their gender expression in terms of clothing. So like the expectation on cisgender women and trans women and women in general is kind of that you have to dress a certain way. Like you're not wearing enough clothes, you're wearing too many clothes, you're not wearing the right type of clothes. Like there's a lot of like gendered language and things that are expected of you if you're kind of not a cis male, for example. So I think a lot of people think about their gender expression in terms of the clothes that they wear, the haircuts that they have, etc. And it's a thing that a lot of people, a lot of the sort of population will think about. And it, particularly as well for like gay men or people that are like men that dress more feminine and things like that. Like it's something that everybody is kind of thinking about a lot. To put some words that we talked through into these, you've got sort of male, female, intersex, and then gender identities, sort of trans man, trans woman, non-binary, agender, female, male, and then, you know, your lesbian, gay, straight, queer, pan, etc. And gender expression being sort of like masculine or feminine or androgynous. There's some sort of, you know, there's a lot of, again, nuance within gender expression and how people express who they are throughout kind of how they dress, how they wear their clothes, what sort of hobbies they have, the things that they fill their time with, etc. So the gender expression becomes very, very large and complicated quite quickly, I think. Of course, we're coming at that from the lens of LGBT inclusion and thinking about LGBT identities, but there are so many more things that make up who you are as a person. So thinking about different parts of your identity. So, you know, you've got your gender expression and your gender identity and your emotional and sexual attraction, etc. But you've also got things like location and race and age, like whether or not you have a faith or belief, your class background, etc. Like you have a lot of different things about you that make up who you are, and all these things play into how you access services, how you sort of navigate the world, and how you can kind of get through different things and challenges within your life. I think a really good example of this is like, if you think about two separate people within this. So if you think about a Black trans woman who lives in rural Scotland, who is trying to access a healthcare service, she is going to have an experience that is completely different to someone who is cisgender, white, lives in North London, and, you know, has a different healthcare system. So like, there are so many different barriers for those two people to access the exact same thing. And I think when you're thinking about identity, you have to think about the nuances within people's identity and how different bits of their identity intersect with other bits, to make different things more challenging. And I think when you think about that, and you think about yourself within this, you can think about the things that are maybe give you a little bit more privilege, or the places where you have space to bring other people along with you. So, I mean, I guess, for example, like, I don't really think about my race that often, nor my age or my disabilities. I have ADHD, which doesn't mean it doesn't mean I have to think about how to access a space in terms of like physical space. I don't have to think about whether or not there are going to be steps into a building or a meeting room, or whether or not I'm going to be able to hear things properly. I don't think about my race because I'm white. I never have experienced racism. I'm 33, I think. So like, I don't really think about my age that much in terms of like how I navigate the world and how I navigate different situations. But I do think about things like my class background. I do think about sort of my gender expression and how I look and how I am being in certain situations. You know, I think about that when I'm walking down the street with my girlfriend holding hands, like, is it safe to do that in this situation? If I'm talking to leadership groups, sometimes I do these sessions to like, you know, CEOs of organizations. And when I go into those situations, I'm thinking about my class background a lot more than I am perhaps in this session. And, you know, like, I have a very northern accent and from a working class background in the north, like, I'd think about my class background a lot more in certain situations than I might think about, you know, my gender identity or my gender expression. So I think it depends on what spaces you're in, the things that you think about and the things that you don't think about. What's really interesting, I think, is like, this can change from like hour to hour, meeting to meeting, space to space, particularly for LGBT people who might be out in some places but not out in others. You get a lot of people that might sort of be out at school but not at home, or out in college but not out to their friends but out to their family. And like, there's lots of different sort of ways that people will express their gender and think about their gender identity and the sex assigned at birth and all those things in different ways at different times of day in different situations. So it's definitely worth thinking about that when you're working with people that are maybe younger or might identify in different ways. I think something like 70% of young people like under 21 identify as something other than straight. So actually, it's really important to think about things like that and think about how people like act in different spaces and how other people think about other people. I wanted to put this in because I think it kind of feeds us in to the next bit and gets you thinking a bit more about identity in a different way. So thinking about the reality of things, like, people generally get more than other people. There's a huge disparity across different services, across education, across lots of different things, particularly in creative industries, particularly in the music industry. You know, a lot of different organizations are very white-led, very male, cisgender-led, and that's the reality for a lot of people, particularly in the circles that we are all working in. Equality is like the kind of assumption that everyone benefits from the same support. So like, if everybody is treated equally, then it means that everybody gets the same level of support. And I think a good example of this is my mum. When I came out, my sister is straight, and we're twins. And my mum was very much like, I'm going to treat you exactly the same. Nothing will be different. You know, I'm going to treat you the same. But actually what that's not acknowledging is that actually I might need more support in different places for different things for different reasons. And it might be because of my gender identity, it might be because of my gender expression, it might be, you know, because of the people that I'm attracted to and the people that I want to spend my life with and things like that. So I think a very good example of that is kind of thinking about the fact that my sister, who is straight, has had a baby, and that just happened for her quite quickly. She didn't really have to think about it. In fact, I don't think she did think about it. It just happened. And that is a thing that now exists in her life. For me, if I want to have a baby, I have to think about things like adoption, whether or not I have you know, secure housing, which I rent a house in London. I don't have secure housing. You know, I have enough money in the bank. IVF or adoption, both like are very long processes to go through. IVF in particular, like depending on which part of the country you live in, can cost anything from, you know, £5,000 to 15, 16, 17,000. I think in Hackney, where I live, it's £17,500 for 3 rounds of IVF, which straight people, heterosexual couples get for free. Queer couples get to pay for, which is a huge campaign that Stonewall are actually running at the moment around equality in IVF. But I think that really paints a good picture of what equality and equity actually means when it plays out in real life. Like, that assumption that everybody will benefit from having 3 rounds of free IVF if you can't get pregnant actually doesn't create equity, because there are people that can't actually get pregnant in the natural way. So they might need a little bit more support. They might need something else. So actually, that's a really good example of like the difference between equality and equity, and why it's really important that actually you think about people's identity and the barriers that they might have, in order to create a situation where, in this case, everyone can watch the baseball, but, you know, everyone can kind of do that kind of thing. And then justice. I think justice is a great one. I feel like it's not something that we are going to achieve in our lifetime. Like, complete social justice for everyone isn't something that we can achieve, but it is something that we can all try and work towards. So the small things that we can do to try and address some of those barriers and address some of the systems and processes that people have to go through is really helpful, and something that actually, despite not being able to kind of achieve full social justice for everyone in our lifetime, actually, you know, giving people the support that they need to be able to, in this case, see the baseball game, is really important. That is, you know, the causes of inequality were addressed and the systemic barriers are removed. Whilst we live in a right-leaning capitalist world, that's not going to happen. You know, one day it might, but I've got a feeling that it's not going to be in the lifetime that we live in. But it's good to work towards, and I think that's something that is also useful to think about in terms of like community care and self-care, and looking after yourself within working on this stuff. Because actually, like, you know, if you feel like you can't achieve full social justice for everyone, it's because you can't do everything. You can't do everything yourself, and you're not an expert in the things that you do. You just have to do small things that work towards a bigger change, which I think is really important. This is the part where I touch on LGBT experiences, and we start thinking about kind of how people navigate the world and what things happen in different situations for different people. I've pulled quite a few stats from Stonewall, but also an organisation called Just Like Us, who are great. I would absolutely, particularly if you work with young people in like education settings, have a look at Just Like Us, because they do loads and loads of great work. Their CEO, Dom, is one of the nicest people I've ever met. We used to work together, and he's really nice, and they just do great work. So a couple of stats on this slide. If anybody can if anybody can just like pop any reflections in the chat or whatever, that would be great. This next 2 slides is going to be just touching on suicide and self-harm for the next sort of like 2 bits. So what I'll do is just pop a emoji in the chat, and then once we've done that. Once we've done with it, I'll put another little heart in there. The stats, so the Just Like Us stats are from this year. They're very, very recent. Yeah, it was last month for the Just Like Us stats. The Stonewall stats are 2019, the Stonewall stats. They're doing another round of this next year, I think. So they do their sort of like research rounds every 3 years. But yeah, the Just Like Us one is very recent, so it's very interesting. School pupils been twice as likely to have been bullied, 91% having heard negative language about being LGBTQ in the past year. It's quite a lot of students then go on to university, and 42% of them have hidden their identity at university. So that sort of, you know, hearing negative language about LGBT and being bullied at school has a real knock-on effect to people's university life and then therefore their work life after that. 48% of trans people don't feel comfortable using public toilets due to fear of discrimination or harassment. That's an interesting one, I think, and good to pull up, because I always joke with my uncle, who's a plumber, that I talk about toilets more than he does. But actually, there's a thing that a lot of people refer to, particularly in the trans community, called trans bladder. And it's basically that there are more trans people are more likely to have bladder infections, UTIs, and other things to do with, you know, like bladder, things, because they will hold in their urine, they will stop like drinking enough, they won't eat well, and stuff like that, so that they don't have to use the toilet when they're out. When they're out and about in public, and because they don't feel comfortable enough to be able to use public toilets. So there's a lot of like healthcare knock-on effects for trans people, particularly around like trans women and trans men that like don't want to use public toilets, or don't have access to a gender neutral toilet or even an accessible toilet that they can use. So stuff, you know, when people sort of say, oh, gender neutral toilets doesn't really matter, like anybody can just use the toilets here, it's fine. Actually, it's really important to have spaces for people that they know they're protected, and they know that if something happens in those toilets or anything like that, then they can report it, or, you know, it's not tolerated in this space, etc. And it's kind of a very important part of building a safe space for people. 50% of LGBT pupils hear homophobic slurs frequently or often at school. That's another from Just Like Us. And LGBT young people are twice as likely to contemplate suicide. Black LGBT people are actually 3 times more likely. So I think that is a very stark way of looking at that identity piece that we looked through earlier, in terms of like different parts of different people's identities really have an effect on kind of, you know, how they navigate things, how they have a support system, whether or not they do have a support system, and what different bits of support people might need based on different parts of their identity. Last slide on this, but it's not all kind of like doom and gloom on this slide. Actually, the Trevor Project did a study 2 years ago about pronouns, and just something as simple as having pronouns respected actually reduces the amount of suicide attempts for trans young people by half. And pupils in schools with positive messaging about being LGBT were less likely to experience suicidal thoughts and feelings. And that positive messaging is really linked to school pupils having better well-being. Like, they did this study and it was like, regardless of whether or not they're LGBT, a lot of the non-LGBT students also said that it helped them with their well-being and feeling included and feeling like school was a safe space for them. So, you know, positive messaging, role modeling, all that kind of thing is just clearly super important for young LGBT people. And having an inclusive environment to work in really allows people to make better connections, like make better friends, make better working relationships. It's proven that it increases creativity in people, and gives people that space to really be themselves and not have to waste their energy and time thinking about how to, you know, navigate not telling people that they're trans or not telling people that they're LGBT, etc. So it gives people that kind of, yeah, it's much better for people's well-being, but also like the way that people work. So on that, visibility, I couldn't do this without putting a picture of Harry Styles on a slide, sorry. But visibility is incredibly important. And I think one of the things that some of these artists, so there's Imagine Dragons, Harry Styles and Little Mix, some of these artists, you know, a lot of the time, you know, they're flying a rainbow flag, they're like doing a lot of things for LGBT communities, but what they're saying there is like, not just like, you can come to our shows, but it's like, their audience, like a lot of their audience are going to be LGBT. Like I said earlier, like 70% of young people under 21 identify as something other than straight. So actually, like, it's really important that, you know, people know that they're included, and not just included, but allowed to be part of it, and they're a really important part of that audience. So yeah, I feel like these three artists are the ones for me that do it the best. Jade from Little Mix is actually someone who, when I worked at Stonewall for a long time, and she came in and we did a trans inclusion session with her and her manager. And it was incredible because she was like, I don't know anything about the trans community, but I know that this is a problem and that trans people need something from, you know, the media that is positive. So they really took that on board and like, yeah, invited us to her birthday party, which I couldn't go to, unfortunately. It's one of the biggest regrets of my life, not going to Jade from Little Mix's birthday party, but there you go. But small like acts of visibility are really, really important. I think like a lot of people will use like lanyards and badges and things like that, particularly in corporate workplaces and stuff. And again, when I first started working at Stonewall for like maybe like 6 years ago or something, everywhere I went, someone gave me a rainbow lanyard, and I was absolutely sick of rainbow lanyards. I've still got a drawer full of rainbow lanyards. And everybody gave me them in like, we're doing this, it's great. And I kind of knew the importance of it, but I didn't really think about it until about 2 years into working there. And I went for a smear test at the doctor's, which is, of course, quite a stressful thing to have to do. It's not a nice experience for people. If you've had one, you'll understand. If you haven't had one and you can get one, get one. That's my top tip for today. But I didn't realize the importance of rainbow lanyards until I went to the doctor's for this test. And I was sitting in the waiting room and I was kind of nervous. And I was like, oh God, last time it wasn't great. And I'm really nervous and a bit anxious. And the nurse came out to get me. And she had a rainbow lanyard on. And I did not realize how much I was holding my breath until I saw her wearing a rainbow lanyard. And I was like, oh, this is going to be fine, because I can talk to her about the fact that I'm in a same-sex relationship. When she asks me if I'm pregnant, we can both laugh. Like, there's lots of things that like, now I feel more comfortable having those conversations, and I know that she's not going to be weird about it, and she's not going to kind of, you know, I just felt so much more comfortable. So having that is incredibly important. Like the badges, the lanyards, like putting your pronouns in your email signature, etc. Like it just gives people space to relax, and that's incredibly important, especially for young people and especially for LGBT people, because there are a lot of situations where, you know, they might not be out at home, they might not be out within their friendship groups, but it gives people space to relax and gives them a person to relax around, and that's incredibly important. I think sharing LGBT resources and working with role models is really important. So like if you're in a place where you're bringing external people into your organization to do different talks and different workshops and things like that, like it's super important to make sure that you're bringing queer people into that, bringing LGBT people into that, but also bringing people of color in, bringing people with different disabilities in. Like all those things are incredibly important. And I think a lot of people in the room will have heard, if you can't be what you can't see. And I think it's incredibly important, you know, when you're working with people that are, you know, language is ever evolving and identity is an ever evolving thing, and more people are identifying across the LGBTQ spectrum. So it's really important to bring those people into your organizations. Challenging homophobia, biphobia and transphobia when you hear it can be a difficult thing to do sometimes, but actually, even if that's just checking in with the person who's been, you know, at the forefront of it or has been a victim of it, like checking in with that person and making sure that they know that it's not acceptable and that they've got someone that can support them is really important. and celebrating things like LGBT History Month and Trans Day of Visibility and all those cool things. Like, I know a lot of the stats that I put in there were kind of a bit bleak and a bit sad and probably not great to hear, but actually there is so much joy within the LGBT community. There are so many great things about being queer that actually you can celebrate, and you can bring people into your organization that will celebrate their identities and celebrate other people's identities. And if you're in a position to doing that internal work, like making sure your policies are inclusive, that people have routes to reporting stuff like homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, like knowing you're protected by policy is really great, but it does need to be backed up by, you know, the actual challenging and the actual, like, you know, celebrating of LGBT identities within the workplace and the organizations that you work in. So we've got like 10 minutes left. And I think what would be really useful is thinking about your specific job roles. So if you want to share these in the chat as well, that would be really great. But thinking about like what influence and control you have, thinking about your identity within your workplace and like places that you can give other people space or platform, like things that you can do to create a more inclusive environment for LGBT communities. Something that you can do today, so it might be just, you know, buying a rainbow lanyard or sticking your pronouns in your email signatures, anything like that, talking to people about this stuff, doing a bit more research, etc. Something you can change over the next few months, so that might be something around policy work, something around, you know, something different, and then something that you might need help with and the other people that might be able to help you with that. Because like I said earlier, when we was talking about sort of like social justice, you can't do it on your own. Like there isn't a world in which we can do this on our own. And actually what LGBT people need is allies and people that can help them achieve equality. And that'd be really meaningful. So anything that you might need help with and the other people that you could bring in to help you do that would also be great. Again, pop them in the chat. If there's anybody that needs help with anything, ask for help in the chat group. There's, you know, there might be people in here that can help you. But yeah, something you can do today, something you can change over the next few months, and then something you might need help with. There might be like, you know, application processes that you can add pronoun options to in your organization. Might be, you know, lots of different things there. I wanted to also pop some media recommendations in. There's a couple of podcasts here, some books, some telly to watch and some films to watch. It might be that one of your things to do today is watch one of these films or buy one of these books or think about, like, you know, other bits that you can do. Some really good films on this list. Pride is a great film. It basically marries both my interests of mining communities in working class Wales and gay people. So, you know, it's a full Venn diagram for me, that. Milk is also a great film. So many good things in this chat already. Sharing notes from this session, rainbow lanyards. I actually don't know if there's anywhere particular to get rainbow lanyards from. I'm not sure I don't know if there's a charity that sells them, or I guess just don't buy them on Amazon is the only tip. But yeah, look at internal reporting structures. That's a great one. Wonderful. Putting pronouns in email signatures and talking to colleagues about doing the same. Brilliant. Wonderful. Actually, Rachel, I think Mermaids do some merch and Stonewall also do merch, but I don't know what bits of merch they do. So maybe have a look at Stonewall and Mermaids for lanyards and stuff. Requests in my organization include pronouns in surveys and application forms. Yeah, it might also be like, not just like application forms for projects and stuff, but like your recruitment and stuff like that. Like, how are you bringing people into your organization? What's in your induction processes, etc. Where do you get training? Stuff like that. Arranging training for colleagues and member organizations. Yeah, great. Bring Casper along. Yeah, just get Casper to come and chat. Everyone. Love it. Yeah, I did a session a few weeks ago for a touring organization who basically just do loads of different tours, and some quite big ones, some small ones. But I talked about a band who do allyship really well, and they sort of like fundraise when they're on tour for different trans and LGBT organizations that are really local. So thinking about like whereabouts you work and what local organizations there are that do like specific LGBT inclusion work, or like, you know, support LGBT communities in yeah, anywhere where you live, like seeking them out and seeing how you can support them is also really great. Wonderful. Any guest speakers in Kent? I know quite a few people, Annie, who do like different speaking engagement type things. So I'll send a list to you if you want. I think most of them are in London, but would probably travel to Kent. What I can do with the help of others, based off what other trans people want to be changed, work with my organisation and the community to implement direct action in the local scene. Great, love it. There's a couple of charities as well on this organisation. I've put Come Play With Me on there. There's also like some specific music organisations. So Come Play With Me is on there. 3T Tortec Training do loads of really good like training for LGBT Black people and any people of color. Like they do lots of different sort of training programs to train people how to do Tortec, which is great. Ladies Music Pub is an inclusive meetup for women in the music industry. It's trans inclusive, non-binary inclusive as well. And Saffron, a record label based in Bristol. But yeah, some really good organisations here, like UK Black Pride are great, Girls Rock London, great. Some really good organisations to sort of think about. If you're working in Europe, which I don't know if anybody in this group is, ILGA Europe are really good at like mapping LGBT inclusion and LGBT policy across different governments in Europe. So it'll tell you kind of what countries are safe, which countries aren't quite as safe, what the human rights for LGBT people looks like in each country. And they've just released a map, a new map for 2022 on like, they basically rank all the European countries in terms of LGBT inclusion. Malta's at the top, they're like 97% or something. But yeah, if you're interested in stats and graphs and maps, ILGA Europe are great. And it also tell you like where you can go on holiday if you're queer, or where you can't go on holiday. One thing I always think about is like how equal marriage is great and is a thing that happens now, which is wonderful. But actually there are lots of countries where LGBT people can't go on their honeymoon. So that's something to think about as well. Cool. I'm going to leave it there, but I'm also going to leave this screen up so you can take some of the info off it and stick around for any questions if anybody has any. I feel like there's loads of chat in the group, which is good. People seem to be chatting to each other. Like Phoebe just said, Mind Out are really great, really good for like training, and it's particularly around like mental health. Thank you so much.